All right. Well, thank you to the Society for the invitation to talk to you about dealing with a complaint with the Board of Licensure. A little bit about my background. I am an attorney, professional engineer, and professional land surveyor. I've been licensed as a surveyor for almost 50 years, a professional engineer for around 30, and also as an attorney at law for 30 years. I'm none of these things, though, in your state. So keep that in mind. There may be some discrepancies between what I describe, the process, versus what actually occurs in that particular state that you're licensed in. I realize many of you that I am talking to are licensed in multiple states. So keep in mind that there is some variation between licensing boards among the various states. I should mention that I have served as a member of the board. I have represented the board as an attorney, and I've also represented surveyors that have had a complaint filed against them. So I've been involved in all three sides of the complaint process. So let's go ahead and begin talking about dealing with a complaint. First thing is the question that often comes up, because many of you listening are thinking, well, is this really going to apply to me? And let me just begin with the first question then. What type of surveyors generally have a complaint filed against them? And it's been my experience that most complaints are filed against what I would call good, competent surveyors. And you say, well, how does that happen? It's my theory that good, competent surveyors are aware that they do quality work. They're confident in their work. And therefore, when they get complaints from a neighbor or a client, they'll deal with them on the first level, but then they are so confident that they tend to just dismiss further arguments, right? I'm right. Client or neighbor or whoever else is making the complaint, you're wrong. And that infuriates the other party, and they go ahead and file a complaint. Now, it's true that there are complaints against what we might refer to as incompetent surveyors, but I would say they're definitely on the minority. So who's likely to file a complaint? I would say at the present time, maybe 20 years ago, this wouldn't have been true, but at the present time, it's actually the board itself. The licensing board itself probably files most complaints. And those complaints involve failure to comply with continuing education. There's an audit done and the licensee does not have sufficient continuing education. And the other one, that's a big one in many states, is what's called a certificate of authorization. In many states, in order to practice surveying, engineering, and a lot of professions, you not only need to be licensed as a surveyor, but you also need a certificate of authorization if you're practicing. Now, let me back up a little bit. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. If you're a licensed surveyor and you're working for a company, it's the company that's required to have the certificate of authorization, not the surveyor themselves. However, if the surveyor is a sole proprietor and is practicing and offering to practice in that state, they better have a certificate of authorization. And it's been my experience that this certificate of authorization is being adopted in many states as more of a revenue enhancement, a way to bring in extra money into the government. And so it's a dual source, both the license itself and to get the certificate of authorization. And so what happens is a surveyor that's operating in a state that doesn't require a certificate of authorization decides that they'd like to expand their business. And so without thinking, they go ahead, they obtain their license in the other state, they offer to practice services, but because they don't have a certificate of authorization, the board files a complaint against them. And there's really not a lot you can do to fight that. You either have the certificate of authorization or you don't. Now, sometimes somebody will have a certificate of authorization. And by the way, these are often known as COAs. They let it lapse, like their license, and they continue to practice not thinking about the lapse. And again, they're in trouble with the licensing board. So that's a major source of complaints, is the licensing board in this current period. Of course, many of us haven't thought of that source, although I see it when I was on the board that that's a major source. But I would say the next major source is probably the client. The client, and then behind that would be a neighbor. Now, when you think about that, so why would the client be filing a complaint against the surveyor? It's been my experience talking when I served on the board and talking with other board members from other states, the biggest reason is a failure of communication. Now, I'll be the first to admit, after close to 50 years of practice in surveying, that there are some clients that it is very difficult to communicate with. And it's almost the reverse of what I sound, because they demand constant attention. And so it's like they expect, when you're being retained by them to provide services, that there's just this constant flow of information that they want from you and advice they're willing to give to you. And that tends to irritate surveyors. I know it irritates me when I'm dealing with that type of client that seems to know what should be done and demands that the surveyor do it, or demands a constant flow of information to that client. What's happening? Why didn't I see anybody on my property today? When are you going to survey it? What do you mean you have to spend 5-6 hours doing record research? I had that done when I bought the property. I don't need it anymore. I've given you the title abstract, and on and on and on. And of course, a lot of the communications then involves the billing. Why is this so much? You didn't tell me it would be this much, and so on. So knowing the source is your client and the likely reason for the client filing a complaint, my advice is, and how to avoid a complaint, is to be very careful picking your clients. I realize, and I'll be the first to admit, the first 5 years I was in practice, I just didn't know. I would love to have somebody listening to me now, just somebody experienced. All right. I know there are several of you that have, decades of experience surveying. If you would just write down some of the characteristics for a newly licensed surveyor to look for in a bad client. I mean, I had to learn that the hard way. And then I've dealt with surveyors representing them where they've called me and asked me for advice on certain clients. And you can see this same pattern among bad clients, right? The demanding type that will argue over a fee before you've even started. The ones that start telling you what you need to do for them, not telling you what they need, but telling you actually what to do for them. These are all characteristics of a client that will file a complaint against you out of frustration when you don't meet what they perceive are their rightful demands. So obviously, that's one thing. The neighbor, keep in mind that in a lot of boundary disputes, the old saying of shoot the messenger will often apply, in that when the client and the neighbor are in a very heated dispute and you show up, you're viewed as the enemy as well. And there's just going to be a certain type of person that wants to take retribution against you. Now, let me say this. When we talk about the neighbor filing a complaint, it's been my experience and research that surveyors, and in fact, all potential expert witnesses, enjoy an absolute immunity against any type of complaint or lawsuit if there is an ongoing dispute where that surveyor is or is very likely to be an expert witness. Now, I haven't investigated for your state, so this is not an absolute, but every state I've looked at has recognized this immunity. And why is there an immunity? There is an immunity because it's called witness intimidation. All right, let me repeat that. It's called witness intimidation. So if a party in litigation attempts to bring the expert, a complaint against the expert, in most cases, this is looked at as attempting to intimidate a witness. And that witness enjoys absolute immunity to the point that the cases I've seen that complaints, and I didn't see it for surveyors, but I saw it against doctors and others, that the complaint is dismissed at the board level immediately. That is not even allowed to proceed because of the intimidation that it brings about. The surveyor that faces this should have the client's attorney immediately go to the judge and get an order that would force the board to dismiss the complaint. I don't care if it's valid or not. It gets dismissed. The board doesn't even get to look at it because of witness intimidation. Just the fact that the witness has to deal with a complaint is viewed as intimidation. So therefore, a complaint from the neighbor has a potentially different defense than a complaint from others, So long as, remember, a surveyor wouldn't qualify for this immunity unless the boundary dispute is in litigation or is likely to be in litigation. All right, so I just throw that out there. A lot of attorneys that I've dealt with in the past 30 years aren't aware of this immunity that an expert has. And so I throw it out there. If any of you listening to me are ever in this situation, your best thing is obviously to maybe talk to your own counsel, but also talk to your client's counsel and say, look, this is what's happening. It's clearly an attempt at witness intimidation. I believe there's an absolute immunity against this, and get the client's attorney to look into that and prepare a motion, present it to the judge so the judge can squash this complaint right away. All right. So what we were talking about how to avoid a complaint. And obviously the check for your continuing education. Of course, I'm speaking to the choir right now. Those of you that are listening are getting your continuing education in order that you can meet your licensing, relicensing requirements. Just remember the certificate of authorization in other states, if it's not in the state that you're currently residing and practicing in. Next question before we deal with the complaint process is, what are the ramifications of a complaint? All right, what do I see when I have surveyors that call me up, say there's been a complaint filed against them? The first thing is there's some embarrassment, especially good surveyors. How can this happen to me? Right? I practice good. I try to comply with standards. I never expected this. It's like a tax audit. Well, maybe a little worse. You're just embarrassed because those of you that are listening to me have thought, hopefully I've dispelled that notion, that only bad or incompetent surveyors have complaints filed against them. And that's clearly wrong. Most complaints, in my experience, have been filed against good, competent surveyors. So get that out of your head. But there is that embarrassment. Oh my, what if other surveyors hear that a complaint's been filed against me? It's almost like reading about yourself in the police log and you're just embarrassed. You're thinking, oh boy, somebody's going to see my name and think bad of me. That's the first reaction. Then there's anger. There's anger at the client. There's anger at whoever filed that complaint against you. How could they do this? And then there's tremendous stress. It's like your day is consumed thinking about this complaint. Your entire livelihood is on the line, you think. It usually isn't. Very seldom is your license going to be suspended or revoked. Obviously, if you don't have your continuing education or your certificate of authorization, your license is suspended. But for a complaint about negligence, failure to comply with minimum mandatory standards, something like that, very seldom is your license going to be revoked or suspended. It's usually a fine. But having said that, under this stress, you're thinking, oh gosh, I am going to lose my livelihood. If my license is suspended or revoked, I'll be out of a job. I will have no income. How do I get any income without my surveying license? And so your entire day is stress. And of course, you have other things that you should be thinking about. And all you're thinking about is this complaint. Your next emotion is, I've got to get rid of this. I've got to push on. This is causing me too much anxiety. And so, unfortunately, many people hurriedly prepare a response, thinking that the complaint is baseless, and it very well may be, as we'll talk about during this session. It very well may be baseless. And it may even seem ridiculous. And you're wondering why the board bothered even notifying you of that, what you feel to be a baseless, ridiculous complaint. And so your response tends to be hurried. You tend to put it down. You tend to lash out at the complainant, the neighbor, the client, telling the board they're irrational. They really don't know what they're talking about. You look at it maybe as more of a personal attack on that person, thinking that when the board gets that, they'll immediately agree with you. It'll be dismissed. You'll get an apology from the board, and all this will be put aside. Can I assure you that that absolutely will not happen? The complaint may be dismissed, but you're not going to get an apology. It's not going to disappear. It's not going to be like a bad dream. It's going to be there. Now, the fact that a complaint's been filed against you and has been dismissed means that there's nothing on your record to indicate that you've been negligent or in violation of the board standards. Nevertheless, for the rest of your life, you will have to say, if you're ever deposed and you're asked the question, which I often ask surveyors when I'm an attorney deposing them, has a complaint ever been filed against you? And you have to say yes. Doesn't mean you're a bad surveyor. It doesn't mean that you can't do competent work. It's just one of those things that there's a little check mark. It's like, have you ever been in a traffic accident? Those aren't pleasant. You like to avoid them, but it's happened. All right. As you think about that then, and keep that in mind, that stress, that anxiety that you're feeling, and some of you listening to me have had a complaint filed against you. I have not yet, but I've dealt with enough surveyors and discussed with them and sat down with them and talked to them and, rationalized with them. And like I say, I think I'm a good, competent practitioner, engineer, surveyor, attorney, but complaints get filed against good, competent people. So I'm not going to say just because I'm competent, I believe I'm practicing competent, ethically, and so on, that somebody's not going to file a complaint against me with the board. It's very easy to do. There's no gatekeeper at the window or the portal now on most boards. So you got this stress, you got this anxiety, you got anger, you tend to lash out, you tend to want to keep it. You don't want to let other people know about it. You certainly don't want to talk to other surveyors about a complaint being filed against you. unfortunately, that's not necessarily the best thing. It may help to call up another surveyor, and certainly if I'm going to advise that in many cases, you talk to legal counsel, right? And as we go through the complaint process, I think why I'm suggesting that advice may become apparent, why you'd want to talk to legal counsel. All right, so when we look at the personal ramifications, there's also legal ramifications. And I just mentioned being deposed and having to, an attorney ask you if there's ever been complaint filed against you and having to admit there is, but it's been dismissed. So it doesn't affect your credibility, by the way. It's just that that's just what the attorney's going to ask, because it could be that you were judged to be in violation of certain standards, and that may affect your credibility. The long-term ramifications are if you have been in violation of standards or mandatory continuing education, a certificate of authorization, and so on, there's a fine typically involved in that. So you're going to pay monetary damages. Your license may be suspended. You're going to have to suspend work. Even if your license is not suspended, if you're missing continuing education, you're going to have to spend some time away from work to make up for that, that continuing education that you've missed, that you now have to show the board that you've completed. Here's one thing that I've noticed that many surveyors miss that get them in trouble. And I'm going to mention this again, hopefully before the end of both sessions, because it is extremely important. And I've seen a lot of surveyors get caught with this. But most licensing boards require, and I'm pausing here for effect, most licensing boards require that when you've been judged to be in violation by one state licensing board, you must report that violation within 30 days to every single board you are licensed with. All right, let me repeat that. If you are judged in violation with one licensing board and you're licensed in multi-states, you must report that violation with every other board within 30 days. Now, some boards give you a little longer, but most boards require you notify them within 30 days. That board, in turn, may hold you liable for the same violation. And it becomes a cascading event. So if you violate mandatory minimum standards, continuing education in one state, the other state that you're licensed in may also find you liable for the same one. So there's no rule against double jeopardy. And you may be fined and have your license suspended in the other states you're licensed in. So I realize that there's some surveyors that say, well, I'm not going to let them know about my violation in one state because they might pull or find me in the other state. The thing of it is, these violations are now entered into a database at NCWS. And often the other boards learn of them through them. Now you're in violation of failing to inform the board within 30 days. So I've seen this situation occur many times. Let's say a surveyor failed to renew their certificate of authorization in one state. And that state fines them for being in violation. The surveyor then fails to notify the other boards that they're licensed with that they've been found in violation with a licensing board. The board I've sat on in this, it was in the state of Maine, the engineers board, doesn't require a certificate of authorization. If that licensee had notified the board I sat on that they had been in violation of failing to have a certificate of authorization, our board would have done nothing, because it is not a violation not to have a certificate of authorization in Maine. Maine doesn't require a certificate of authorization. So the notification would have been said, thank you for the notification. No action will be taken by this board, period. But because they didn't notify us within 30 days, they are now in violation of the rules of the board. And so they were disciplined for not notifying us. So that's a ramification, a long-term ramification that you have to look at when you're going through this complaint process. Do I fight it? Do I go ahead and accept it and just get it out of the way because of the stress, the anxiety, and whatever? I need to put it behind me. I'll go ahead and work with the AG, work on a compromise, admit some violation, get a consent decree, pay the fine, and put it behind me. Well, if that's going to have a ripple effect, you might say, no, I better fight this. If I think I can win, I better fight it, because it's going to have a tremendous ripple effect, because I'm licensed in 3 and 4 states. All right, let's go ahead and start talking about the complaint process. What are the steps? Well, the first step is the initiation of the complaint. Now, the initiation of the complaint, as far as failure to meet continuing education, most boards do an audit, I would say between 5 and 10% of their licensees every year. They just send out an audit notice in which you then have to submit, usually on a board prescribed form, showing the continuing education, the number of hours, and then in many cases having to show proof of attendance on this audit. Failure to do that within a certain time usually initiates a complaint. All right, so let's put aside that source of a complaint. Let's look at the client or the neighbor, or in rare cases, another surveyor filing a complaint. In the old days, which aren't so old, you could just write to the board. You go on the website, get the board address, write to them and say, my surveyor set up their GPS. They would call it GPS. They set up their survey equipment and it attracted lightning, and lightning struck my house and burnt the house down. It doesn't matter what they say. All right, they write to the board. And when the board gets it, that's the initiation of a complaint. Now, let me say this, that most boards, if it's an unsigned complaint, drops it in the trash can. The complaint itself, the wording, the charges can seem ludicrous, like I just used as an example. And the board will go ahead with it. I mean, it really has to be really ludicrous before the board just drops it in the trash can. But in most cases, an unsigned complaint gets dropped in the trash can. You can't file an anonymous complaint against a licensee. It's just not acceptable in most states. Now, I said the old days, most boards now, you can do it online. There's a portal within the board, has the little portals, you put in the name, put in the surveyor's name, and then you make a statement and you push send, and poof, it's sent to the board. And that's the initiation of the complaint. There's no having to go to a notary. There's no having to cite a particular standard that's in violation. Like I say, the equipment set out in the front yard and a lightning bolt striking the house, and the homeowner's sure it was the surveyor equipment that attracted the lightning. It's sent into the board. Now, I would hope there's a few boards that would say, well, and drop it into the trash can, but a lot of these boards are very sensitive to the charge that they're protecting surveyors, or they're not doing their public duty of watching out for the public. So they do take that complaint, even though you would think as a surveyor that it's ridiculous. They go ahead and now put it into the process. And the process is this. There's generally a preliminary assessment by a board administrator and a complaint officer. A complaint officer is typically a board member that's been designated to handle the complaints. It's usually a surveyor. I guess in rare cases, it might be an attorney or a public member of the board. And I should back up, because I've assumed that those of you listening to me know what the licensing board is, and that perhaps a reach that I shouldn't have done. So let me apologize right now for those that are just entering the profession. But licensing boards are composed, for the most part, of licensed surveyors. But there is always 1, 2, or 3 members that are public members. And when I say public members, it's you can't usually be an engineer and asked to be on a surveyor licensing board. Now, a lot of licensing boards are combined surveying and engineering boards, but where they're separate, generally if they're involved with the National Council of Examiners for Engineers and Surveyors, NCEES, you can't be a public member, so-called, on the board. Of course, the state laws control this, but there are some public members. They're put there to make sure that it's not I'll use the term loosely because it's not all men, but a good old boys club, right? There to protect surveyors. So there are public members, between 1 and 3, typically public members. The rest are licensed surveyors. And a lot of times there's standards for the appointment of the licensed surveyors. They have to have been licensed for so many years, many times 10 years or more. They're appointed typically to the board by the governor. So there's always some thought that political donations might get you on a board, and I'm not going to say it does or doesn't. You can take my word for it. I didn't make any political donations to get appointed to the board. Sometimes the board's required to have certain members appointed to it. For example, the engineers board I was on, the chief engineer for the Department of Transportation was and always will be a member of the board. That's just the way the statute was written. I've seen boards that require at least one member of the board be a faculty member from a public institution within that state that teaches that discipline. And the reason is it helps with examinations and examination interpretation and so on. So when they wrote the statute making the board, that was like a permanent position for one of the board members. So sometimes a board member has to be from a designated area, maybe a public utilities or something like that. But anyway, these are members of the board. Most of them have been in practice for many years. Many of them looking at a complaint say, there, but for the grace of God would I be. They've been there. They may have made the same mistakes that somebody that's before them on a hearing may have made. And so there's a lot of sympathy for that person that's appearing before the board or that may have a complaint filed against them. All right, so again, that's your board composition. It's a privilege and an honor to have served on a licensing board. It's an eye-opening experience. I would encourage anybody that has the opportunity to do so. And for those of you that are listening to me that may be on the board, bless you. You're not there for the money. I think I got $10 every day I devoted to the board. I probably lost $500 in earnings for that $10. So you're not there for the money. I can't say you're there for the prestige because nobody knows who you are. It's not like you walk into a room and somebody says, oh, gosh, there's Canute, a member of the licensing board. So it's not prestige. It's just you have a sense of duty for the profession. So enough said on that. So going back to this complaint process, we have a preliminary assessment by typically the board administrator. There's sometimes the board administrator is a licensed person. Often they're not. They're a public servant that they may just be a board administrator for that particular board, or they may have several boards that they administer to. It all depends on, I guess, the number of licensees and how much work it is and how often they meet and so on. So that board administration and the complaint officer, and often involved in that is an assistant attorney general, an AAG. The Attorney General's office has numerous assistant attorney generals, and they often assign one of those lawyers to the board. And that lawyer is not only legal counsel for that board, but is also legal counsel to several boards. I would like to say that it's always the best and the brightest that represent the boards, but that's not always the case. I've dealt with some truly excellent assistant attorney generals, and I have dealt with some that I just can't believe they got their law license, to be honest with you. It all depends. So that preliminary assessment often involves 3 people. One of them is a surveyor. One of them provides that technical analytics that's often required to look at a complaint. That their job is not necessarily to dismiss it out of hand or do an evaluation. They do look at it to make sure that it's signed, that it's not totally laughable. But if it meets a very minimum threshold, it's put in the hopper. And by what I mean by put in the hopper, typically that complaint, a copy of it, along with a formalized letter, is sent to you, the surveyor, with a demand that you are to respond to that complaint, usually within 30 days. And that starts that stress, that anger, that I need to get this behind me. How can this happen to me? Stress that I've previously described to you is when you get that letter in the mail from the board, and then you read the complaint that's being made against you. And you're even angrier if you realize that it shouldn't have any basis. You're angry. Why didn't they throw this out? Why am I now being brought into this? And it always ends up that it's the busiest time. That's, you may have planned a vacation that next week and everything's put aside. I mean, you've got to give this some serious consideration. Not responding is a complaint in of itself a violation, right? Not responding is of itself a violation. All right, let me just go through. I've sort of talked through some of these, but I do have it in your handouts, so you don't have to write anything down, but I have the initiation and what I've talked about. Preliminary assessment. Now, what I didn't talk about, I said, has it been signed? But the board also looks at it and asks, does the board have jurisdiction over the individual named in the complaint? And as a general rule, they don't unless the person's licensed. Now, some states do give the board the authority to handle complaints against non-licensed persons that are deemed to be practicing the profession. Most states do not. So the complaint is, I won't say dismissed, but it's referred to the Attorney General's office for action because the board has no power. The only power the board has is over licensed individuals. Now that would include, by the way, surveyor interns, SIs, or in some states it's called surveyor in training, SITs. If they're either licensed surveyors or SITs, the board generally has jurisdiction over that. So they look at that. Is there jurisdiction? Is the person licensed? Does the board have jurisdiction? If it does, all right. The next thing I have there is the matter involved in the complaint within the board's jurisdiction, or more properly handled through civil litigation. what happens here is, and I would say this, that most boards don't necessarily dismiss it, but if the board sees this as a boundary dispute, in other words, the neighbor's complaining because the surveyor so-called doesn't know what they're doing and put the boundary in the wrong location. That's more appropriately described as a civil litigation problem. And in some states, the board will determine they don't have jurisdiction. I will say this, that in most states, that still gets put in the hopper and it's dismissed at a preliminary hearing level, but not at that initial assessment, that preliminary assessment. Contract disputes would be another one that's more of a civil litigation. In other words, what's happening here is the complainant, the person making the complaint, doesn't want to hire a lawyer, doesn't want to go to court. And if you listen to my other seminars, you know that litigation's very expensive, $40,000 or more. And so they're trying to get retribution on the cheap. And the cheapest way is to file a complaint against the surveyor, let the state use its resources against the surveyor, and they don't have to pay any money. And the state at this point saying, nope, sorry, this is better handled in a civil trial. You're going to have to hire a lawyer, sue the surveyor, and take it by that route. And then, of course, the third point there I spent a great deal of time on is the complaint signed. Anonymous complaints are not usually accepted. I will say won't say never, because I can see a situation where if it was a danger to the person making the complaint, or there was going to be some kind of severe retribution, that may be grounds for the board to not dismiss that complaint pending further investigation. I have a note there that's very important. The board does not evaluate the complaints on the merits at this time. The old lightning rod, the survey equipment attracted the lightning bolt and burnt the house down. That's evaluating on its merits. They generally don't do it at this time. So please don't get upset at the board. You're going to get upset at the board. I've seen my clients get upset at the board. Why didn't they dismiss this? This is ridiculous. They just don't do it at the preliminary assessment. They aren't looking at the merits of how well the client or the neighbor or the other surveyor wrote the complaint. They're accepting that everything is true, and at that point, that's the preliminary